The following episode covers sensitive topics such as murder, suicide, and mental disorders. Viewer discretion is advised. Sandra Rivet was an intensely compassionate and well-traveled young woman from the United Kingdom. Her unrelenting courage, unmistakable strength, and undying hope for a better life were all cut short by a ghastly murder in the autumn of 1974, leaving all who knew her in the royal home of Lord Lucan and the entirety of Lower Belgrave Street in London, grasping for answers in a sea of mysteries that drowned us all in doubt. This is an examination of the murder of Sandra Rivet and the disappearance of her killer, Richard John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan, in the Belgravia district of the UK, and the 50-year history of one of London's most intricate and infamous unsolved crimes. But first, we'd like to thank Aura for sponsoring this video. Disappearing in the time pre-internet was relatively easy, as shown by the story we're telling in today's episode. These days, it's much harder to disappear online, and sometimes your personal information ends up public and you aren't even aware. You just Google yourself one day, and suddenly you see your private information on a public listing site, and you know that people are selling that information to data brokers. It can be shocking, invasive, and scary to see your phone number or email out there. Luckily, today's sponsor, Aura, can help you with this problem. Aura will identify potential leaks and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf, making the process easy and painless. Data brokers are legally required to remove your information, but they make it a headache to do, and so Aura takes the sting out by doing the work for you. Sign up using our link and get 2 weeks to try Aura completely for free. Aura doesn't just help you remove your data, it also protects you from online threats. You can do everything in one app, like parental controls, a VPN, password management, and more, all for one easily affordable price. Life is complicated, and there are often too many things to handle in one day. Let Aura take care of your online safety, so it's one less thing to worry about. Sign up to Aura today and get your 2-week free trial by going to aura.com/coldcasedetective or by clicking the link in the description box below. And now let's dive in with today's mystery. This is Cold Case Detective. Sandra Rivet was born on September 16, 1945, in Basingstoke, Hampshire of the United Kingdom. The family didn't hang around Hampshire for long, however. When she was just 2 years old, in 1948, the Hensby clan moved out of Europe all the way to Australia, where they would remain for the next 7 years. From an early age, Sandra displayed a unique personality with an undying curiosity about the world around her. She was a fast learner and creative in the logic she upheld, and while she wasn't much of an extrovert, she knew how to make friends and get along with her siblings at home. In 1955, Sandra and the rest of the Hensby family moved back to the United Kingdom, this time settling in Croydon, South London. It was here Sandra found an admiration she didn't have in Australia and became quite popular amongst other students at school. Despite fitting in, Sandra struggled academically. While her logic and street smarts made her quite the intelligent young girl, her marks did not reflect this savviness. Unfortunately, these issues followed Sandra from primary school to secondary school, and she failed to get into university for a post-college career. The reality of the situation frustrated Sandra at first, but she eventually accepted the outcome and looked ahead to better days. It didn't take long for the better days to arrive. Sandra was able to lock down an apprenticeship as a hairdresser and worked under close tutelage for the following 6 months. After gaining that skill, Sandra turned her attention to secretary work. She quickly acquired a secretary job at a local firm in Croydon, allowing her to live at home and only make a short commute. Unfortunately, after a couple of serendipitous job opportunities, the luck ran out for Sandra. She had been seeing an unidentified man on and off for months until it finally ended for good, and wasn't responding to the breakup very well. Reaching a boiling point in her mental health, Sandra checked herself in voluntarily at a hospital in Red Hill, Surrey. There, she was treated for symptoms related to depression, but was able to make a full recovery and re-enter society. Back in the Greater London area, Sandra met a man named John, a local builder and well-respected businessman in the neighborhood. After dating for a few months, the pair became engaged, and Sandra was able to lock down another job, this time as a nanny for a doctor who lived in Croydon. In 1963, Sandra and John discovered they were pregnant with a little boy. 9 months later, on March 13, 1964, Sandra gave birth to Stefan, her only son. Despite having a baby together, John and Sandra's relationship quickly began to crumble. The engagement was ultimately called off, and Sandra had to move back in with her parents at Croydon. She knew she couldn't take care of a newborn baby in the state she was in, and requested Stefan be put up for adoption. Not wanting their grandson to be left to the state, Mr. and Mrs. Hensby filed an application and were ultimately rewarded as Stefan's adopted parents. To get back on her feet, Sandra once again changed careers and became an aide at a home for the elderly. When she found she wasn't cut out for that hospital, however, she quit and moved to Portsmouth, Hampshire to live with her sister. In Portsmouth, Sandra kindled yet another relationship, this time with a Royal Navy seaman by the name of Roger Rivet. They married on June 10, 1967, back in Sandra's hometown of Croydon. After a while, Roger took on a job as a loader for British Road Services. This allowed Sandra to find part-time work too, and she continued her old caretaker duties, this time at Reedham Orphanage in Purley. 6 years later, in 1973, Roger switched careers to a tanker at Esso, now known as ExxonMobil. This took him and Sandra back to Kenley, and Sandra got out of the orphanage business and into the cigarette business at a company back in Croydon. Roger's new job allowed him to travel, which turned out to be disastrous for the couple. While he was away, Roger would grow increasingly paranoid and suspicious of Sandra, eventually accusing her of being disloyal to him while he was out on his trips. Despite Sandra's assertion of her innocence, Roger never let it go, and the couple divorced in May of 1974. Roger moved back in with his parents, and Sandra was forced to look for additional nanny work once more. A Belgravia domestic agency in the Belgrave in central London listed Sandra's contact information in their hiring books, and her assistance was eventually requested. The first request came from an elderly couple living in the Belgrave district. Sandra excelled in her role, and soon received notice from John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan, that her services were wanted at his private home. John, more frequently known as Lord Lucan, had 3 children, and his wife needed help attending to during the morning and evening hours. Sandra was able to fit it into her schedule, and quickly became well acquainted with both Lord and Lady Lucan and their kids. However, these pleasantries were short-lived. In a shocking attack, Sandra was bludgeoned to death with a lead pipe, supposedly by Lord Lucan himself, on the night of November 7th, 1974, in Belgravia, London, England. On Wednesday, November 6th, 1974, Sandra Rivet spends an evening out on the town with her then-boyfriend John Hankins. The couple usually met on Thursday nights because that was Sandra's night off, but had to reschedule this time around. Besides the time change, everything else goes according to plan that evening, and Sandra returns to her residence undisturbed. Normalcy continues into the following day, on Thursday, November 7th, 1974, as Sandra carries out her usual nanny duties at the Lucan household on Lower Belgrave Street in London, England. Day turns to night, and all seems well and good between Sandra and the Lucan family. At 8 p.m. that same evening, Sandra calls her boyfriend John on the Lucan household's telephone during a short break from her work responsibilities. Between 8:30 and 8:50 p.m., Sandra puts the 2 youngest Lucan children to bed in the upstairs quarters of the home. At around 8:55 p.m., Sandra seeks out Lady Lucan, formerly known as Veronica Mary Duncan. Sandra finds Veronica and asks if she'd like a cup of tea. Lady Lucan obliges, and Sandra sets off for the kitchen. When Sandra reaches the kitchen, located in the household's basement, she fails to even fill up the tea kettle, as an assailant moves in behind her and strikes her on the head with a wrapped lead pipe, repeating the attack until Sandra is bludgeoned into submission and eventually killed on the spot. Once Sandra's pulse stops, the assailant picks up her body and places it into a mailbag made of canvas. A few minutes pass by, and Lady Lucan becomes restless upstairs. Wondering what could make preparing tea take so long, she leaves her chair and trots down to the first floor. Another minute passes by, and the lady of the house stands at the top of the stairwell that descends to the basement kitchen. She calls out for Sandra without hesitation, but is quickly attacked from behind herself. As Lady Lucan is attacked, she attempts to fight back. During the violent quarrel, she is able to bite the fingers of her assailant before being shoved face first into the floor. After screaming at the attacker, an eerily familiar voice shouts, "Shut up!" Lady Lucan would later tell a judge and jury that this voice sounded exactly like her husband's voice, Lord Lucan himself. Near the end of the violent encounter, Lady Lucan is luckily able to reach behind her and grab her attacker by the testicles. As she squeezes, the man releases his hand from her throat and shouts out in pain, giving up the fight. This is where the truth becomes clouded. According to reports, Lady Lucan runs away from the attacker and finds her husband, Richard John Bingham. However, it's described as a non-violent interaction, with Lord Lucan calmly telling his wife that he killed her when Lady Lucan asks where Sandra was. In a bizarre twist, some reports claim that Lady Lucan offers to aid John Bingham's escape from their Belgravia manor on the condition he would wait for her injuries from the attack to heal. Apparently, after this engagement, Lord Lucan visits the upstairs quarters and sends the eldest daughter to bed. He takes Lady Lucan into one of the bedrooms and asks her to lay down blankets so as not to stain the bedsheets. While she sits on the bed, Lord Lucan asks if there were any barbiturates, to which Lady Lucan replies, stating there are some in the bathroom. Lord Lucan enters the bathroom to find the medicine, as well as to wet a small cloth to help clean Lady Lucan's wounds. In the heat of the moment, Lady Lucan uses Lord Lucan's task as a distraction and jumps up from her spot on the bed and dashes downstairs. Lord Lucan, unable to hear anything from the bathroom, carries on ignorant to his wife's escape. Once she is outside, Lady Lucan seeks refuge in a public house known as the Plumber's Arms. It is here she hides from her husband until the police arrive. Meanwhile, back at the Lucan household, Lord Lucan finally realizes his wife is missing and doesn't hesitate to hatch his own escape plan too. He leaves his Belgravia home for the final time, just before 10 p.m. Sometime between 10 and 10:30, Lord Lucan arrives at Madeline Florman's house in Chester Square, the mother of a friend to Lord Lucan's eldest daughter, Frances. He pounds on the door, but is never met by any of the home's occupants. Inside, Madeline ignores the raps on the door, as she is the only one there. After a few minutes of waiting, the knocks stop and the phone rings instead, only to hear a bunch of gibberish coming from the other line. During the phone call, Madeline is able to make out something regarding her front door and puts the receiver down. She walks to the doorway and swings the front door open to reveal a blood stain on the doorstep. Later forensic work would classify the blood stain to contain two different blood types, blood groups A and B, the two types belonging to Lady Lucan and Sandra Rivet, respectively. Madeline rushed back inside to the phone, but the other line was now dead. She immediately slammed down the receiver, picked it back up again, and dialed for the police. Then, sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m., Lord Lucan phones his own mother and tells her to go to his house and fetch the children. He tells her that something terrible has happened in the home, and that he had driven by and saw Lady Lucan fighting with an assailant in the basement and ran in, only to find her screaming. The police later attempt to track down the precise location of where Lord Lucan dispatched the call to Madeline's home and his mother's house, but it is never learned. On the other side of town, Lady Lucan finally makes contact with the police. Law enforcement tells her they've forced entry into the house, where Lord Lucan is nowhere to be found. However, they do discover Sandra Rivet's body still in the canvas mailbag downstairs. Lady Lucan is then put into an ambulance and rushed to St. George's Hospital in Tooting, London. Her husband, on the other hand, drives his Ford Corsair sedan to the home of Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott, friends of Lord Lucan. It is located nearly 68 kilometers from his home. At the Maxwell Scott residence, Lord Lucan comes across as quite disheveled and unkempt in the eyes of Susan. He also sported a dark, wet stain of sorts on his hip. When Susan confronts Lucan, he tells her and her husband that he saw a man attacking his wife, and when he went inside to comfort her, he slipped on a pool of blood, and that's why he looks a mess. Despite the bizarre story, or the fact that Lucan was with his friends rather than helping his family, neither Ian or Susan suspect Lucan of foul play. They also don't turn on their radios or televisions that evening, failing to see the news and hear of the entire Lady Lucan ordeal. While Lord Lucan is at the Maxwell Scott home, he writes 2 letters addressed to his brother-in-law, a man by the name of Bill Shand Kidd. One of the letters is regarding his side of the story to the attempted homicide on Lady Lucan's life, and his fear that he will be framed for the ordeal. The other letter addressed non-important financial matters. A third letter is later recovered, however, where Lucan wrote it is unconfirmed. This letter addresses similar fears Lord Lucan is having, and he asks the recipient, Michael Stoop, to look after his children whenever he can. At around 12:30 a.m. on Friday, November 8th, Lord Lucan calls his mother a second time to say he'll call again in the morning and won't speak to police that night, waiting until dawn on Friday to speak to the authorities. 45 minutes later, at 1:15 a.m., Lord Lucan drives away from the Maxwell Scott property. A few hours later on that next day, Roy Ranson, the chief detective superintendent in charge of the investigation, arrives at the Lucan household on Lower Belgrave Street. With him is the divisional surgeon, photographers, forensic scientists, and petty officers. In the first sweep of the house, authorities discover no forced entry outside of the door they themselves kicked in, a bloody towel in Lady Lucan's bathroom, and a lot of blood at the top of the basement stairs. Police also find a bloody pipe that morning in the Lucan family home. Near the pipe are broken picture frames, a broken metal banister, and other various damaged walls and surfaces from around the general area. Next, law enforcement attempts to track down Lord Lucan so they can bring him in for questioning. First, they try to reach him at 5 Eaton Row, a flat Lord Lucan had lived in since 1973, when his marriage started crumbling due to a growing gambling addiction. After the Eaton Row flat proved to be empty, police then checked another address at 72A Elizabeth Street, where Lucan's mother said he would stay at times. At the Elizabeth Street address, detectives find a full suit and shirt laid out, a Greek book, a wallet, car keys, cash, a driver's license, and Lucan's passport, tissues, and glasses. Outside, there was a blue Mercedes-Benz, but when the police attempted to start it, both the engine and battery were dead. After the detailed search at the Lucan household wraps up, police follow up with Lady Lucan, who is still at St. George's Hospital and under heavy sedation. Despite the drugs, Lady Lucan is able to describe the general circumstances of her attack, while never accusing her missing husband. Over the next couple of days, a post-mortem inspection of Sandra Rivet's body goes underway, under the close watch of famous pathologist Keith Simpson. Keith discovers that Rivet was killed before being placed into the canvas mailbag, and that the lead pipe found in the house was most certainly the murder weapon. Authorities also make a trip out to interview Sandra's ex-husband, Roger Rivet. Roger provides a rock-solid alibi, as do other men associated with Sandra's previous relationships. Around the same time period, Lady Lucan is finally released from the hospital and is allowed to take her kids back home, before eventually moving to Plymouth due to the disrespectful nature of the press at the time. On Sunday, November 10th, law enforcement discovers the Ford Corsair driven by Lucan the night he was last seen. The car is found in Norman Road, New Haven, which is only 26 kilometers from Uckfield, where Lucan stopped over with the Maxwell Scott couple. The Corsair is impounded and combed through later that day. Inside, investigators find a second piece of lead pipe hidden in the trunk of the car. The pipe features surgical tape wrapped around the cylinder, but no blood. There was also a bottle of vodka sitting next to the pipe. Detectives then take a survey of the surrounding neighborhood and interview fellow residents of the community. 2 different witnesses claim the Corsair had been parked there since at least between the hours of 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. on November 8th. November 10th is also the day Michael Stoop informs police of the third letter written by Lord Lucan. However, he had already thrown the envelope away, and police couldn't track the postage of from where Lucan mailed out the letter. On Tuesday, November 12th, an official warrant for the arrest of Richard John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan, for the murder of Sandra Rivet and attempted murder of Lady Lucan is filed. In the following weeks, detectives send out professional search and rescue squads to comb the New Haven Downs area where the car was recovered. They search grounds, the harbour, and all other public areas, only to find the skeletal remains of a judge who had disappeared years ago. A couple of small inquests are then held in the aftermath of the immediate investigation. The first takes place on November 13th, where Roger Rivett is brought in to identify Sandra's body in an official capacity. The second takes place on June 16th, 1975, over 6 months since the murder and disappearance. At the second inquest, Lady Lucan is formally questioned, and she reveals the difficulties she and her husband had leading up to the attack. She says the voice she heard from her attacker was undoubtedly the voice of Lord Lucan, and that her choice to try and help him after the fact was a ruse meant to aid in her escape. The eldest Lucan child, Frances, was brought to the witness stand to tell her version of events from November 7th, 1974. Frances said she heard shouting, then saw her mother, covered in blood, enter her bedroom with Lord Lucan. Lady Lucan had apparently sent Frances to bed, but when she got ready, Frances also heard her father yelling for her mother across the house. When Lady Lucan failed to respond, Frances said Lord Lucan asked her where her mother had gone, before walking downstairs and leaving for good. The next witness is the landlord of the bar called the Plumber's Arms, where Lady Lucan took shelter after she escaped the clutches of Lord Lucan. The landlord says Lady Lucan ran inside screaming, my children, he's murdered my nanny." She could also be heard crying for help and saying she'd just escaped from being murdered. The third major witness was pathologist Keith Simpson, who confirmed Sandra's death was due to blunt force trauma to the head by both the lead pipe recovered in the Lucans' house, as well as the assailant's fists. The final major witness was none other than Susan Maxwell Scott, the last person to see Lord Lucan in the flesh. Susan tells the judge and jury of Lord Lucan's unkempt appearance from the night he paid them an unexpected visit. Susan also speaks of Lord Lucan's mindset right before he disappeared, how he was adamant another man was attacking Lady Lucan, and that Lady Lucan's initial reaction after this supposed attacker ran off was that her husband must have hired an assassin to kill her. By the end of the inquest, the judge and jury had all they needed. By 11:45 a.m. that day, the jury foreman read the murder verdict for John Bingham as guilty on all charges. In the 38 years since the murder of Sandra Rivett and the attack on Lady Lucan, Lord Lucan has yet to be found. Despite numerous sightings and theories stretched thin by both his closest family members and friends, he has yet to be identified or recovered if he is dead. In 1999, Lord Lucan is officially declared dead. However, a death certificate isn't guaranteed until February of 2016. In 2017, Lady Lucan commits suicide despite never knowing the exact fate of her ex-husband and attacker. Yet she remains certain until her last breath that he was the one who took the life of Sandra and nearly her own. While the case of Sandra Rivett and John Bingham is now a closed investigation, until concrete proof of Lord Lucan's demise is brought forth, the chance for ultimate justice still exists for the Rivett and Hansby families. In a case old enough to lack DNA evidence, and sparse enough to lack photographs or CCTV footage, the most fascinating and incriminating clues may be the letters Lord Lucan wrote to various associates the night he evaded the police and departed the Belgravia district of London, England, forever. One of the letters covered Lord Lucan's financial interests he needed to take care of as soon as possible. That letter reads, "There is a sale coming up at Christie's 27th of November, which will satisfy bank overdrafts. Please agree reserves with Tom Craig. Proceeds go to Lloyd's, 6 Pall Mall, Coutts, 59 Strand, NatWest Bloomsbury branch, who also hold an equity and law life policy. The other creditors can get lost for the time being. Lucky." While there isn't much to glean from this piece of information, Lucan was definitely showing his true intentions in the end of the letter. He's basically saying the creditors aren't important at the time and are worth getting blown off if he is to leave, going as far to call them lucky. The second letter is much more enlightening. Here it is in its entirety. "Dear Bill, The most ghastly circumstances arose tonight, which I briefly described to my mother. When I interrupted the fight at Lower Belgrave Street and the man left, Veronica accused me of having hired him. I took her upstairs and sent Frances up to bed and tried to clean her up. She lay doggo for a bit, and when I was in the bathroom, left the house. The circumstantial evidence against me is strong, in that V will say it was all my doing. I will also lie doggo for a bit, but I am only concerned for the children. If you can manage it, I want them to live with you. Counts, trustees, St. Martin's Lane, Mr. Wall, will handle school fees. V has demonstrated her hatred for me in the past, and would do anything to see me accused. For George and Frances to go through life knowing their father had stood in the dock for attempted murder would be too much. When they are old enough to understand, explain to them the dream of paranoia and look after them. Yours ever, John. The letter is addressed to Bill, Lord Lucan's brother-in-law and occasional confidant. While Lucan attempts to argue his innocence, in truth he does anything but. He continues to say his wife accused him of hiring a hitman to kill her, and that he cannot stay because the circumstantial evidence will certainly put him behind bars. Lord Lucan also says the children will not be able to live with him and that other folks will take care of the school fees. None of these claims sound like they come from a man who is innocent, but rather a man who is, in real time, coming to terms with the fact that he will never be able to return again. If John Bingham were an innocent man, certainly he would talk to the police and tell them of the situation. Surely he would embrace his children and comfort them in a time of shock and tragedy. Surely he would aid the police in their search for this unidentified killer. Surely he would do something, anything, other than run away and never look back. The third letter was written to Michael Scoop, who owned the St. James pub and the Ford Corsair, eventually taken and left behind by Lord Lucan in his final moments in the public eye. The letter reads, "My dear Michael, I have had a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidence. However, I won't bore you with anything or involve you, except to say that when you come across my children, which I hope you will, please tell them that you knew me and that all I cared about was them. The fact that a crooked solicitor and a rotten psychiatrist destroyed me between them will be of no importance to the children. I gave Bill Shand Kidd an account of what actually happened, but judging by my last effort in court, no one, let alone a 67-year-old judge, would believe, and I no longer care except that my children should be protected. Yours ever, John." This letter is perhaps the most telling. Lord Lucan is so convinced the world is out to get him, now blaming the likes of an unknown solicitor, psychiatrist, and judge, that he no longer cares. He says he only wants his children taken care of, and that no one will believe his story. Otherwise, the letters speak for themselves, covered in blood and written under the candlelight of a midnight escapade after Bingham's actions in November of 1974. Let us now turn to the most prominent theories surrounding the case of Sandra Rivet. The case of Sandra and John Bingham is unique to Cold Case Detective in that they aren't true cold cases. Sandra Rivet was officially found to have been murdered by Lord Lucan, and while Lord Lucan was never found after vanishing, he is not the victim in question here. Most people believe Lord Lucan committed suicide, a theory held by both Lady Lucan and the detectives leading the investigation. At first, the chief detective Roy Ransett said that while Lord Lucan may have killed himself, it would have happened somewhere outside the Belgravia district and the surrounding cities where detailed search and rescues were held. Other searches eventually transpired all over the world, and yet nothing came of them. One private investigator who took the case over in 2006 stated they had enough evidence to conclude that Lord Lucan actually left London and started a new life elsewhere across the globe. However, what this exact evidence showed was never made privy to the public. If Lord Lucan didn't end his own life, where could he have escaped to? The last person to have seen Lucan alive has a strong theory herself. Susan Maxwell Scott once told John Pearson, famous bibliographer who wrote about the murder, that she believed Lucan did indeed have help getting out of the country, most likely from the aid of financiers, who are only known or accessible to those who are or were once rich. However, Susan also added a twist to the story. She said that she believed the financiers came around on their decision and saw Lucan as too great a risk to fulfill the escape mission. She believed Lucan was kidnapped, killed, and buried somewhere in Switzerland, where the Swiss banks and potential financiers were located. Susan wasn't the only one to concoct such a conclusion. Jeremy Scott, an advertising executive familiar with the Sandra Rivet case, proposed Lucan was killed and hidden by someone with both power and money. Jeremy's thoughts were somewhat valuable, as he had strong connections with a few members of the Clermont Set. The Clermont Set is an above-ground group of exclusive, ultra-rich gamblers from Britain who all could have wielded much darker personalities beneath their harmless exteriors. It is unknown if the police ever followed up with this theory, but with Lord Lucan's elite title and appearance of wealth, it certainly makes sense. Of course, like many missing person cases, sightings of John increased tenfold as word regarding his disappearance reached the ears of people worldwide. One sighting brought police to France. Another brought them to Colombia, where an American businessman that bore a resemblance to Lord Lucan was found, and another where the man described by police was actually John Stonehouse, who had disappeared like Lord Lucan but faked his death as a way to ward off capture. There was also the instance of bounty hunter John Miller pretending to capture Lord Lucan in 1982. However, authorities quickly foiled the job as an elaborate hoax. Another false sighting occurred in 2003 when a former detective followed a man all the way to Goa, India, thinking they were Lord Lucan, only to discover they had accidentally tracked a man by the name of Barry Halpin, a folk singer from Merseyside in northern England. It happened yet again in 2007 when a few members in a small New Zealand community thought a British expatriate living on their streets resembled an aged John Bingham. However, when reporters located the houseless male subject, they quickly learned he was in fact not Lord Lucan. Many people around the official investigation, and curious bystanders in general, felt that if Lord Lucan made his escape and lived to tell the tale, he probably wound up in South Africa or somewhere else on the continent. This was always pure guesswork. However, the heat on investigators to track the Earl down in Africa heightened in the 1980s, when the Lucan children were temporarily moved to Gabon, Africa. Many wondered if this was intentional, so the Lord Lucan could monitor his children from a distance, if not visiting them in secret himself. The only other theory that made sense in the hours after Sandra Rivet was killed was that someone had broken into the Lucan house to target Lady Lucan, but mistaken her for Sandra, and then fled once Lord Lucan arrived, per his own words. However, there simply isn't enough evidence to hold up such claims. Everything the defense tried to argue at the inquest regarding Lord Lucan's innocence had a counter-argument. While it was true that Lord Lucan's fingerprints were not present at the scene of the crime, Lucan's defense team at the inquest had no answers for why he had a second piece of lead pipe in the trunk of his car. The lead pipe in the car had a similar appearance to the one used to murder Sandra, and while forensic scientists could not state for certain the two pieces were cut from the same pipe, they said it was most likely that both the pipes and the surgical tape wrapped around them were of the same cut of materials. Not only that, but the bloodstains found inside the Ford Corsair were tested and found to be part of the AB blood group. Remember, the blood found on the crime scene was from both the A and B blood groups, but it was possible the stain in the Corsair was a combination of the two separate blood sources, from Lady Lucan and Sandra Rivet. The defense also had no proper rebuttal to the witness testimonies that shared Lucan's semi-secret desire to murder his wife. They can call it a joke or a coincidence, but in truth it sounds nothing more than a foreshadow to murder. There also wasn't a single piece of evidence outside of Lucan's letters that led investigators to believe a second man was on the Lucan property on November 7, 1974. Firstly, police had no suspects who matched the description or had any motive to kill Sandra. Secondly, there were no clues hinting at a forced entry at 46 Lower Belgrave Street. Thirdly, there was no way for Lord Lucan to know Sandra or his wife was being attacked in the kitchen in the basement, because the only way to look into the kitchen from the street is through the tiny window facing outside, which Lucan would have to stoop very low to the pavement to even access. Not only that, but the basement kitchen light was not functioning at the time because it had been screwed out of its fixture and placed on a chair sitting in the room, meaning with someone with the knowledge of the kitchen's interior would have screwed the light bulb out as to cloak their crimes in darkness. In fact, Lady Lucan had never even entered the basement itself in the first place, contradicting Lord Lucan's own words, and even if she had been down there, and even if she had been attacked by an unknown stranger, they wouldn't have been able to escape out of the basement kitchen door like Lucan said. The door was in fact locked the night of the murder. In addition, there were no signs of a rushed escape or anything of that nature in the barricaded garden that sits right outside the basement door in question, nor any eyewitness testimony by the Lucan's neighbors that placed a strange, shadowy figure in the vicinity of 46 Lower Belgrave Street. The only reasonable claim that Lord Lucan's defense team could use was that if Lucan wanted his wife dead and was familiar with the house, why would he go out of his way to kill the nanny first, whom he certainly would have recognized as not being his wife? It is a fair question, but there are possible answers. For a murder and escape premeditated, it wouldn't be a shock to hear Lord Lucan killed Sandra on purpose as to create this very doubt in the minds of investigators, thinking that if the nanny was killed too, her killer must be someone who did not know the faces of his victims. In the end, it was just another twisted idea in the mind of a twisted killer who committed a twisted crime. It is a fool's errand to spend time debating who killed Sandra Rivet, or how she was murdered. It is clear, based on both physical evidence and the testimony of Lady Lucan, that her husband is the prime and only suspect, and that Lord Lucan ran away post-assault and homicide to flee from capture and avoid punishment for his crime. He had a motive. He was scared to death of losing the little custody he had left of his children, bitter about his wife's legal battles and declining mental health, and enraged over the continued gambling addiction that plagued him ceaselessly. There is no question here. The assassin was Lord Lucan. Seeking justice in this case is not a useless endeavor. While many have accepted that John Bingham is likely dead, either by suicide or other causes, even if he is old, he could still be alive. A man of Lucan's former wealth and power would have the connections to make sure they had the best healthcare available, no matter where he ended up in the world. He would be 88 in the present day, and despite the years since the murder, no man is too old to face justice and answer for their crimes. While Lord Lucan, the murderer, may never see justice, we want the focus of this story to be on Sandra Rivet and the loss her family endured and who she was as an individual. Sandra was a courageous survivor of violent relationships and a battle against depression and anxiety. She spent a portion of her life watching the world through a barred hospital window. She didn't deserve to leave the earth just as she was beginning to find her true self. Sandra was also unabashedly compassionate. She took employment wherever she could serve others, especially the elderly and the young. She listened to the stories of the old folks she cared for, while spreading wisdom to the children she watched over. Sadly, Sandra dealt with her own darkness. She had infinitely bad luck when it came to striking romance, and could never totally escape the lesser side of love. Maybe she had finally found that at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, with 3 children she grew so fond of, if not for their father's seething rage and untampered jealousy. It is our duty to remember Sandra as she was, and not think of only a body in a canvas mailbag, but a woman full of promise, strength, who was writing a story for herself with a happy ending, despite surviving a life of tragedy. Sandra Rivet deserved to live, and that is how she will be remembered. This is Cold Case Detective.